So the next session then is taking us into the world of data and cyber. So please welcome to the stage Ben Densham to explain to us, understanding the risk, how safe is your data really?
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here this afternoon. I was very excited this morning when Chris first stood up and said he was going to be donating £500 to Ben, and especially when he was going to be encouraging everybody else to text me money. But I then realised what Ben actually was, and that's a far more worthy cause than lining my Christmas pocket. So I'm here this afternoon just to talk to you about cyber security. I work for a company called Nettitude. We're a cybersecurity consultancy. We do a whole range of work in many different areas. We do a lot of security assurance testing, penetration testing. We have a team of consultants that go out and do a lot of assurance work and technical architecture work and help entities who have sensitive data how best to protect that. We also run some managed security services, including a managed logging and outsourced security operations center, where we look after client data in terms of looking at their logs and helping to detect breach activity and then giving people advice around incident response and how to deal with that. And as an organization, we also then have a research function. And we do a lot of work around malware and malware analysis. We do lots to do with looking at SCADA and industrial control systems, and as part of that, we have some projects around connected vehicles and looking at the cybersecurity risks and concerns and how things can be improved in that area. And we've done some recent work with Lancaster University around a particular grant-funded project, particularly to do with that area. But I'm here this afternoon just to talk to you really about cybersecurity risk in particular. And there's three things really on the agenda. First of all, to give you a quick industry update from our perspective in terms of what's going on and why there is such a concern and interest in this. We're going to give you three strategies on how to help your organizations and your businesses deal with this. So hopefully things that you can take back and use within your organization. And then just set it in the context of risk. So we can fully understand how that really applies to your business, whatever part of the automotive industry you're involved in today. So, first of all, a quick update on the industry. So, if you look at the media and if you look at the news reports that are coming out, and if you watch the cybersecurity events that are taking place, there's a lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of doubts, a lot of FUD, as it gets called, being paraded. You can begin to think, is the world collapsing? Are things falling in on me? How are these breaches taking place? What's going on? And if you look at some of the things that have happened, whether you look at some of the big events around Target in the US being breached as a retailer, if you look at some of the things that have happened with some of the Ford, some of the other manufacturers, Chrysler in the US, and some of the things that have happened within their supply chain, you can begin to get worried. If you take the angle looking at Edward Snowden and the insider threats and how much we really trust our employees and the people who are in our organizations, where are the threats? Who should we be concerned about? How are they going to come against us? And what impact may they have upon our business? How do we evaluate all this and see whether that's something that we need to be worried about? Is it something that I need to be concerned about? How do we actually evaluate that? Well, there's many things happening, and there's lots going on. If you look at the industry, Gartner did a survey recently to look at some of the concerns and some of the areas that are going to be coming forward in IT in the next 5 years. And if you look through these, a lot of them have security implications. They've come up with this grand title called the Nexus of Forces, just to be a bit more dramatic about it. But they've come up with these 4 and recently added 5 things that are going to change the IT world in the next few years. And as we go through these, just think about your own business and think about how many of these things you're already engaging with and how many of them are a part of what you do. So first of all, we have social interaction. How many of you have business tools where you are trying to engage with your customers more, where you're using your suppliers We heard this morning about the insurance companies trying to deal better with their clients and linking in the communication flows through the body shops and linking back to the vehicle manufacturers. How many of you already got tools in place to try and help that or aid that, where you're using social media as a forum to do that? And not just on the sort of LinkedIns and social media things that we're very familiar with, but also business-to-business tools that are being created to share information, to make it available, to make it able to pass around. Well, that's one of the big areas that's been identified as going to be increasing. Mobility. We're not now constrained by our office walls. We're not keeping our data within our office networks, but we're using our mobile phones, our smartphones, our tablets. We're arranging for people to work from home. We're encouraging people to have their iPads or their remote systems where they can connect them up in the field or do work at premises other than the normal office. Many opportunities for the mobile and mobility to come into play. Just generally information. They estimate that roughly every single one of us, on average, receives around 3 terabytes of data. Whether that's coming in through your email or it's people sending you files, every single year, on average, 3 terabytes of information is being passed around. But what is that information, and is that valuable information? Do we need to be concerned about that and looking at ways in which to protect it? Also, the cloud. How many systems have you already got in your businesses where actually you're now reliant upon the cloud to provide some business function? Whether that's your HR services, whether that's suppliers, whether that's information where you gather data from the vehicles or the work that you're doing. The reliance on the cloud and that facility and that function means that a lot of the security responsibilities are being passed out to other entities. Well, if you're doing that and you're entrusting your customer data to somebody else, how do you know that they're taking care of it? How do you know that your reputation isn't going to be the one that's damaged if something should happen through that third party? So that was how they first looked at it, and then recently they've just added in the Internet of Things as the 5th area. Now, the Internet of Things can mean many things to people, but they reckon on average there's going to be around 50 billion devices connected to the Internet by 2020. The things that are now getting IP addresses are not just your smartphones and your smartwatches or your health, fitness gadgets. You've got fridges, you've got coffee machines, you've got all sorts of devices being connected up. And obviously, as we move forwards, more and more cars are going to be more and more connected, and elements within the car on multiple levels are going to be connected to the internet and going to be potentially accessible or potentially accessible by people. So that's sort of some of the areas. This was actually reflected in a UK government report last year as well, and they also identified the same areas. And also that for many organizations, although they're embracing the functions and the features of these technology areas, actually security is playing very much a back foot in terms of how people are thinking about it. For many organizations, they start to use these things, and it's only after the event or after something has happened when they actually assess how that is going to impact their security or the data or the suppliers that they're using within those networks. So how are the threats evolving? How are things changing out there? Well, there's a number of things that are taking place. I don't know if you heard about some of the recent breaches that have taken place. A year or so ago now, Adobe had a hack take place in their business. And to start with, they thought about 1 million usernames and passwords had been ripped off and had been stolen by the hackers and were being made publicly available. A few weeks later, they came clean and said, oh, it's not 1 million, it's a few million. It's maybe even 50 million. Wow, that's still big. And then another 2 weeks later, the hackers actually dumped the password list on the public internet, and it was actually 150 million usernames and passwords that had been compromised that were now publicly available. Well, you might sit there and think, well, what's that got to do with me? Surely that's Adobe's problem. You know, they're the one who's got their name in the press. It's their accounts that have been compromised. But the reality is, how many of those users who've got an Adobe account have actually got accounts within your systems? How many of them have reused passwords that have been used there that have now been used on your systems? How many of your employees are in that Adobe list? Well, actually, if they are there, then potentially there's an exposure for you. The same password could be the way in which people could get into your email system or into your VPN service or whatever else it might be. So actually educating our staff and helping people to understand the impact of some of these things is crucial. It's one of the first things that we do in some of our security testing is go and see what's publicly available. Use LinkedIn to see who works for you and then see if there's anything that we can reuse. And then you don't even need to hack the systems. You simply use an account that's readily available that provides access in, and you're on your way. But also, we're seeing a proliferation of phishing emails. I'm sure you've all seen the things from Nigeria requesting you to submit some bank account details, and you're going to be rewarded with that £5 million legacy that you never knew existed from that long-lost relative. Well, clearly we can dismiss that sort of thing. But these days, phishing emails are getting much more targeted, much more sophisticated, and the attackers realize that if they can make it personal to you, if they can reference something that is actually unique to your life, your history, relevant from something that may be available on your social media accounts or something else that's publicly available, then the likelihood of you believing that and clicking on it is much greater. And all they need is one click, and potentially they can be inside your business and on your network. So looking at phishing attacks and seeing how that works, we need to be wary of that and think about how we can manage that and deal with that within our business. The government reckons around 33,000 emails are blocked every month into the government networks in the UK where sophisticated malware is being used. So it's not the basic stuff, this is the stuff that's actually being custom written and targeted towards individuals in an attempt to try and gain access to their systems. But we also see that a lot of these things are getting much more organized. If you start to look at some of the threat actors out there, not only are we looking at the criminals who are getting together and forming organized groups, but we're also seeing a lot of involvement from nation states. So if you're an organization or a business or a manufacturer who has intellectual property, or you're looking to come up with the next groundbreaking way of doing something, you can be sure that somebody somewhere may be interested in that particular IP. Many attacks we do see coming from China, where people are actually after the secrets about how things are made. If you look on the internet, you can actually see a model of one of the Chinese fighter jets. And if you look closely at it, it's actually almost identically modeled on one of the F-16s that have been built for the US. It's even down to the actual details around how some of the hinges on the wings have been created to avoid radar. The same materials, the same design, the same process has been implemented in that. And that wasn't come about by chance. That's because someone over there has actually hijacked and broken into the supply chain within the US and found the details out and have reused it when they're building their planes over there. Many occasions we see that type of thing taking place. So knowing about it, how do we actually keep up with this? How do we manage it? It's often described as an arms race. The bad guys are often in front and we're trying to catch up. How do we manage to stay in front? And how much of a concern is this for us in our business, whatever that might be today? Well, many things have been taking place to kind of respond to these evolving threats. The UK government is very focused on this. For the last 5 years, they've had a whole strategy around trying to help organizations understand the impact of cyber risks for their entities and their organizations. They've built a cyber information sharing partnership called CISP, which is open for anybody to come and join. And it's a way for industry experts in different areas to get together and understand specifically what are the threats against my sector, my area. So within the automotive industry, there's a whole section within that platform where you can get together and you can hear about what the current threats are, the things that you need to be concerned about, and how other people within that sector are dealing with it and managing that. They've had a whole initiative around the finance sector, particularly in the UK, to try and deal with some of the systemically important financial organisations within the UK and how they deal with cyber threats and how they actually manage and detect and test for state level and seriously sophisticated attacks upon the UK. They've also been looking at the other end of the spectrum and trying to help small businesses. They've got things like the 10 steps to cybersecurity, which is a very minimum baseline which every organisation should be considering. And they've got other initiatives around things like Cyber Essentials, which again helps small businesses to actually understand how they can actually best protect themselves. Not with great big expensive systems, but with best practice that can be relatively easily rolled out and used within the business. But also the industry has been responding. An organisation called Crest has provided a load of benchmarks and standards around how you go out as a buying community to help and buy services within this area. So if you want to have penetration testing done, if you want to have some form of monitoring and logging that's credible and helpful, if you want to have some capabilities around instant response, how do you know where to go? Well, Crest as an organisation define those standards, and the organisations that are part of Crest will actually then be able to provide you services that meet those standards and can provide you with a level of assurance about what you're getting. So it's a very useful resource to do that. They have 4 key areas that they work through, and pen testing is one of them, but there's other aspects of that as well. So that's just a brief snapshot of some of the things that are going on. And I don't know within your organisation whether you're involved in doing cybersecurity elements, whether you have people who are dedicated to that, whether you have people with responsibilities for it. But there's many resources there that you can tap into to try and help your organisation move forwards. But if there's 3 things that I can help you today with, I thought there would be 3. It would be good to give you 3 strategies to try and help your organisations and give you some food for thought as you go away and think about whether this is a threat and how that can be best used within your business. So if we look back over the last number of years, many people's approach to cybersecurity has been around what we would call defence in depth. So in other words, you set up and you think, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop these people getting in. I'm going to do various things in my business. I'm going to put some technology in place. I'm going to put some processes in place. I'm going to do what I can to make sure they cannot get into my organisation. And then I'm going to fold my arms and think, great, I'm safe. They can't get in. Now, unfortunately, that strategy no longer works. Just deploying a defence in depth or a layered approach to security, all you need these days is a single email with a single piece of malware that was written last night, so it's undetectable by any of the things that are out there right now. And actually, we've said a targeted email to one person in your business could mean that your networks get compromised. So how do we actually protect against that sort of thing? Well, one of the things we've really got to do is try and change our mindset about how we think about cybersecurity. We need to stop thinking that it won't happen and start to think it could happen. And if it happens, how am I going to deal with it? How will I know if I get breached? If you look at the the Verizon data breach report, which came out every year, for the last 4 or 5 years, it's been consistent in the message that it's told. Verizon do a whole range of analysis on data breaches that take place, and they go in, they investigate why, and look at the circumstances around it. And the average time for an organisation to detect that they've been breached is around 150 days. So what we're talking about there is 6 months, half a year. For most entities who had a breach and then are investigated, actually it's taking them half a year before they even realise they had a problem. So this isn't how long it takes a hacker to get in. This is how long it takes the entity to realise that they've actually got a problem. So the chance is that quite a few number of you in the room today probably already have malicious people within your networks. You probably already are compromised by some form of malware or some hacker who's managed to gain entry. They might not be after what their end goal is, and they might not be able to have got that far, but the likelihood is that quite a few people have that. So if we change our mindset and expect to be breached, it changes the way in which we then deal with the problem. So the 3 strategies I briefly want to talk to you about is something we call 360-degree security, something we call response in depth, and something that we call coconuts and avocados. And I will explain what that means when we get to it. So first of all, the first strategy that can help then is 360-degree security. First of all, we need to start with what's important to us. So what is it within your business that matters? Where are your assets of value? Is it your customer database? Is it the payment details of those credit cards where you take the money from people? Is it the information about particular ways in which you do business, or the supplier lists that you have, or the way in which you operate? What is it that's important to you? First of all, what's that asset and where is it? Once you know what it is, you then need to do something to secure it. So those traditional things around security and depth still need to be done. So patching your systems is vitally important. Making sure you're running antivirus, making sure you have things like policies and processes in place. You restrict people's access based on a need-to-know requirement. All these types of traditional things are still needed to try and secure those things that matter to you. But then you also need to do something to test that. Just knowing it's in place is great, but are you actually testing it? Are you verifying that those things are still current and valid? We've got one client that we frequently do some work for, and we went in to do an audit for them recently. And the IT manager confidently stood up and said, I've been working on this particular policy to lock down our network, and it's great. I'm really happy with it. I've got it just where it needs to be. I think it's going to be great. Well, we started doing some testing, and we found that we could install all sorts of random software on his machines. We were able to set up accounts with a password of 1. All sorts of things happened which shouldn't have been allowed. And what this guy had actually done is he'd created this lovely secure policy, but he'd only applied it to one machine. He'd only applied it to his machine. He'd done all the testing on his machine and told everybody within the business that everything was great. And the reality was the whole of his organization, 600 odd people, were actually just as insecure as they were before he'd started. So testing to make sure that what you think you've done actually has been done is crucial. But we don't stop there. Things progress, new relationships with suppliers, new people come into the business. You need to train them, you need to deal with that, you need to manage that change. So you need a process of governance and verification to be able to manage those things and deal with that as it progresses. But we also then need a process to monitor. What we're saying is that you could still be breached. So how do you monitor that? How do you get that awareness that tells that that phishing email has been clicked on, or that malware has been installed, or that hacker is trying to get in through your website or whatever it might be? What sort of monitoring and alerting do you have that allows you to help with that? So these things all feed together, and they wrap into each other, and they get wrapped around with policy, which states clearly to both you, your employees, and your suppliers exactly what you're doing and why. And also, as part of that, we need to be thinking about how we develop and move forwards in terms of our innovation and moving things onwards. So that really is the first strategy. Think about security holistically. Don't give it to the IT manager and say it's his problem. Think about it from a business perspective and think about it holistically. So if that's the first strategy, what's the second one? Well, the second is something that we call response in depth. So traditionally, people thought about defense in depth. But what we're really saying now is that you could be hacked, so now think about your response in depth. For many people, a data breach, they often in their minds think of it as a single event. Oh yes, I got hacked, I got breached, I got owned, as it's called. The reality is, when you break that down, it's not a single event. A data breach actually consists of a whole series of events, and it's often known in the industry as part of the kill chain. In other words, if you actually really understand what a data breach is, there are multiple opportunities for you to both detect that activity and to do something about it. And if you're able to monitor and detect activity early on in the chain and can do something about it, it means that you can protect those assets of value before they get to the point of being compromised. So think about it and your response, your instant response, your ability to monitor, your ability to log, and think, how well do I know what's going on in my networks? How am I getting visibility right through the whole of this kill chain? How do I know, and am I able to respond effectively if I can detect something happening at any of those stages? So if you break it down, you probably can't read that very well, but it kind of breaks down a data breach into a whole series of events and discrete elements, all of which can be detected and monitored if you approach it from the right way and the right methodology from the start. So the Bank of England has been doing a lot of work with the financial sector, as I mentioned earlier, and one of their initiatives is to actually try and enhance the way in which security testing is done. So rather than just looking at a security test in its own right, they're trying to get people to think about what are the credible threats against me, how might they come against me, and then actually run testing scenarios that simulate that And then lastly, then look at how the organization responds. If any of you have ever had a security test done, it tends to historically have been a point-in-time test, where a tester will come along, throw everything they've got at it, and try and hack into your organization. But that's not the real world. That's not how malicious users really will try and get in. So this really is about simulating real-world attacks and trying to simulate them and to test your response about how you would then detect them. So that's the second strategy. Think about response in depth, not just about defense in depth. The third thing that I would then ask you to consider is really thinking about how to protect those assets of value. For many of you, having people who are taking emails and browsing the internet, very often they are sat within your networks. Well, the reality is the people who take emails from your business and the people who click on internet links and go out there, they actually are the people who are the most likely to be compromised. They're the ones who are going to click on that phishing email. They're the ones who are going to visit the dodgy website. They're the ones who potentially might provide the foothold for the attacker to get into your organization. So what we need to do is change our mindset again and not think about our users as part of the internal network, but really see them as a dodgy area, almost like what's called in the industry a DMZ, or an area that is slightly more untrusted. And don't put your assets of value, your customer databases, your spreadsheets, the things that matter to you, in the same place as where your users sit. Try and create a security enclave or a part of your network where you keep that assets away from those areas that are most likely to get compromised. So the coconuts and avocados. Traditionally, if you look at this, a coconut has a hardened perimeter, and that's how many networks would be set up. But actually, we need to think about our networks more like avocados. So we take that sensitive data, we lock it away, we put some extra monitoring around it, and then we have this risky area where our users sit with their email, their internet, and everything else that's going on. And that will enable us then to protect those things that are actually really important to us. The reality is that for most organizations, it's not a single enclave. You actually end up, just to follow the fruit theme through a little bit more, you actually end up with something a little bit more like a watermelon or a pomegranate. You multiple enclaves. HR data over here, IP over here, other data over here, and within your network you have these areas where you protect those things that are really important to you. So that's those three strategies. But then as we finish then, how do we put that in context for your businesses? Clearly this might be a great concern to a bank or an organization that has a lot of data that is really at risk, but how do you understand that in context for your business and for your organization? Well, it all starts with a risk assessment. You need to understand it in the context of risk. So what actually is a risk assessment? Well, risk is made up of a number of different factors. First of all, we have assets that have values. Something might have a very large value to you, something might have a very small value. We then have threats that are going to seek to exploit the vulnerabilities or the weaknesses within your organization and try and get hold of those assets of value. The more threats that are out there, the greater the level of risk. The more vulnerabilities or weaknesses in your systems, your processes, your people, your technologies, the greater the level of risk. And the higher the value of your assets, the greater the level of risk. Once you then know your risk, that will then translate into protection requirements, which you can then meet through specific controls you can put in place, which will protect against the threats and reduce the level of risk. Great, you all get that? Well, just to try and explain that a little bit better, we've got a bit more of a real-world example. So let's say one of you decided to come and turn up to the conference today, and rather than riding out on the BMW i8 that's sat outside, you instead brought along your McLaren P1, which you've just won from your last month's bonus, and managed to park up. You park it outside, you leave the doors open, you leave the keys in the ignition, and you even leave a big note on the windscreen saying that the car is there. Well, clearly, there's an asset of high value. It's at a conference with you lot walking around, so there's plenty of risk. There's plenty of threat actors out there who want to get hold of that. And in terms of weaknesses and vulnerabilities, it's packed with them, the keys, the doors, and everything else about it. Now, obviously, when I drove up this morning, I parked next to your McLaren. I have another risk in terms of the car that's seen there. Clearly, the value is very, very different. I can leave the same vulnerabilities on that car. I could leave the windows down. I could leave the keys in the ignition. I could probably even put a sign saying help myself to it. The likelihood of the same risk going past the different assets with different values, even with the same vulnerabilities, means that the level of risk is very, very different. And it's exactly the same in the business world. When we start to think about the assets that we have in our businesses, and we start to think about the weaknesses and vulnerabilities that are around our systems, we also then need to think about it in terms of the threats. Who could want that data? How could they get to it? What are the things that maybe in our business need to be tightened up or dealt with to deal with that? So really, if you start to think about this from a risk perspective, you can start to evaluate how you need to respond and the most appropriate way for you to respond. For many organizations, they do this the other way around. They start with this lot. They start with the controls. They start thinking about the technologies and the things they need to put in place to protect them. But until you've answered the question why, actually, these controls should be the answer to the question why. You shouldn't start with these and then figure out what you're trying to protect. Again, we've got another client based in the city, loads of money, shed loads of cash. They do this completely the wrong way around. They've spent money on every single IT security technology you could imagine, the latest and the greatest. But when you actually look at how it's configured and how it's set and what the policies are, there's nobody in that business that knows why it's there. They don't know what they're trying to protect. They don't know where the assets of value are that these things are supposed to be dealing with. So I encourage you to start a risk assessment, even if it's just a mental process, to work out what it is that you're trying to protect and then implement the correct controls to try and deal with that. So I hope that's been helpful. Hopefully that's been giving you some food for thought. We have got a stand outside, so if you want to come and talk about any of these aspects, feel free. So just a couple of takeaway thoughts as we finish. Establish some sort of governance. Think about asking the questions why and thinking about who is it that's actually taking charge of this within your business or your entity. Define your controls from your risks, not the other way around. Think about developing a baseline security posture. So use some of the advice from the government, whether it's the top 10 or the Cyber Essential scheme or something much more complex. Think about developing a security baseline in your business. Accept that some areas of your business will have high risk, and actually then design your networks, your systems, your processes to manage that effectively. And finally, don't forget to focus on detection and response. Think about how you're going to know if this happens. Because if the reputation of your company or your clients or your data or the people that you deal with is at stake, then think about it now can actually save a lot of time, effort and money further down the line. So that's it. If you've got any questions, very happy to take them afterwards. If not, we'll hopefully get to meet some of you on the stand a bit later on. Thank you.
Okay, excellent presentation there, and that leads us nicely, I'm sure, into the next one.